On behalf of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, 3CT, I'm the director, Lisa Wedeen, and it's an honor to welcome you to this evening's event on the Kalven Report, which is part of our new series entitled The Corporate University. For those of you who are new to our events in this module, this is a project that begins with the acknowledgement that higher education is in crisis. From budget deficits to the reliance on adjunct labor, from anxieties about woke campus politics to worries about cancel culture, from the erosion of faculty governance to the empowerment of consultants and trustees, the university as an institution is being transformed. This project seeks to make sense of these battles and changes while outlining prospects for a salutary collective future. Now, a word on the topic of today's event, the Kalven Report. According to the Office of the Provost's website, and I'm quoting here, the Kalven Committee was appointed in February 1967 by President George W. Beadle. This faculty committee was charged with preparing a statement on the university's role in political and social action. The resulting Kalven Report now stands as one of the most important policy documents at the University of Chicago. It affirms the university's commitment to the academic freedom of faculty and students in the face of suppression from internal and/or external entities, while also insisting on institutional neutrality on political and social issues. That's the end of the quote. The Kalven Report has, unsurprisingly, generated its share of controversy, which is the reason we are gathered here today to discuss it. But before getting started, I want to thank 3CT's Associate Director, Anna Searle-Jones, for everything she does to make 3CT flourish. We at 3CT are also grateful for the work of Ryan Eckholt and our two student assistants, Heather Welty and Delaney Wallace. I'd also like to thank our participants and to introduce them very briefly. Cathy Cohen is the David and Mary Winton Green Distinguished Service Professor and inaugural chair of the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity. Tom Ginsburg is the faculty director of UChicago's Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression. And Christopher Wilde is the Peter B. Ritzma Professor in the Department of Germanic Studies, whose new book on Descartes will be out in March, just a little plug. Let's give them a round of applause. Now, the format is going to be as follows. I'm going to ask an opening cluster of questions to get the conversation going. Then we'll hear from our participants. I'm then going to ask a follow-up, and then the participants may have questions for each other, and we're going to leave plenty of time for a robust conversation and input from the audience. So here's my first question, and then I'm going to sit down. And it's more of an admission, or it begins with more of an admission. I was quite critical of the Kalven Report before 2023. But as I watch other universities struggle with their free speech policies and fall vulnerable to various pressures, including censorship, I've become perhaps reluctantly grateful for the report's guidance in ensuring that multiple voices can express themselves, in other words, for the free speech protections the report affords. And so I wonder how each of you thinks of the report and how your views have changed over time, if they have. What do you see as the current power of the report, and what are its limitations? So, Cathy, why don't we start with you?
Hello, everybody. Okay, I'm going to break the rules because I have some written comments, right? And then, like, I don't really care, but because Kalven is so complex in my thinking and so important to the university, I thought I wanted to make sure I got some things down. But the first thing I want to do is to thank 3CT for holding this discussion on the topic of Kalven and free speech. I also want to I want to ask us, that this be a discussion, right? There are folks in the audience who I feel like have strong opinions and deep knowledge about Kalven, not the least of which is Jamie Kalven. And the intent of this document, and I'm hoping we'll be able to talk to all of those folks. And I just want to say also that this is, I think, a critical discussion at a very difficult time. I've said that, much like Lisa, I think my views on Kalven have, we might say, mellowed. Specifically, and I'm going to read now, as I've watched police that were brought onto campus at Columbia University to control, quote unquote, possible violence, as I've heard the stories of faculty being told to take down political posters off their doors for fear they might offend or have students feel unsafe, as I've watched the congressional hearings targeting women university professors unwilling to overreach and claim all offensive speech should be targets of punishment, and as I've watched student organizations such as Students for Justice in Palestine be suspended at different universities, suggesting that their rhetoric, their claims, and their vision of history are somehow threatening and inciting of violence. And so it's in this atmosphere that I take actually some comfort in the university's commitment to free speech and its purported stance of neutrality. When colleagues call from other universities to ask what is happening at the University of Chicago in regard to regulating speech, my report often pales in comparison to what is happening at other campuses. Moreover, trust me, I'm going to pivot, but as I've mentioned before on other panels, I understand the significance of free speech, and I will emphasize tied with struggle in making my presence on this panel and on this campus possible. From the abolitionists fighting against the enslavement of Africans, to the civil rights movement, to having my own work banned from the AP African American History course in Florida. So yes, I understand the importance and commitment to free speech. However, just when I start to feel warmth towards the Kalven Report and the principles of free speech, I actually read the report again. And I'm reminded of the many missing and or underdefined principles that make the Kalven Report at best or maybe at least problematic. So let me just outline very quickly some of the areas that I worry about. For example, while I understand and support a principle of promoting free speech, I also know as a Black woman who went to predominantly white universities what it is to feel harmed by speech, often speech from those with more power, such as professors, about what they perceive to be the conditions, characteristics, and behaviors of racialized, minoritized, and marginalized groups with which I identify and from where I come. For example, when speakers who question the intellect and full humanity of Black people are invited to campus to quote unquote debate our worthiness as citizens and people, the message for me is clear that the university's commitment to freedom of expression will come at the expense, most often, of those who are most vulnerable in our communities. As a community, we have to struggle with the question of what does the defense of freedom of expression mean? Does it mean that white supremacy, anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia, Islamophobia must be afforded the rights and opportunity to be aired on a university campus? And maybe the answer is yes, but let's have that debate, or let's have that discussion. These positions represent neither reasonable speech nor evidence-based or rigorous intellectual inquiry. So I am unable to minimize the nature of harm produced by free speech on campuses as part of the collateral damage of guaranteeing free speech. I think we have to take harm seriously and interrogate, is there harm that we will not tolerate? Is hate speech, for example, protected speech, even if it is not reasonable or evidence-based? Now, again, I'm not suggesting we abandon our commitment to free speech, but that we recognize a twin anchor for our work, and that is an expansive inclusion, the idea that we are responsible for creating an inclusive learning environment where every student might have the right to contribute to the interrogation of ideas, the production of knowledge that contribute toward the greater good. I'm going to be quick, I promise. Okay. The twin anchors of free inquiry and inclusion are often highlighted as defining principles of this university, not just free speech, right? So without attention to the twin anchor of full inclusion, then the goal of not just free speech, but free speech that is productive in terms of the pursuit of knowledge or truth is more difficult to meet. Thus, unlike the Kalven Report, we must ask, what does inclusivity demand of us even as we embrace the idea of free speech? What are the conditions under which critical examination and expression is best facilitated? The neutral proclamation that speech should be free from obstruction is one thing, but how do we produce a campus climate that allows for all students to engage in hard but not harmful struggle with ideas? That, to me, is the question for Kalven and how we might think about Kalven. Moreover, if we take this idea of inclusivity and free speech seriously, I think it raises 2 or 3 other issues that I'll quickly mention. First, I think we have to deal with the question of power in our discussions of free speech. In the Kalven Report, the author, I won't do my whole quote, there's a whole quote in there, and I think it is misconceived to believe, in fact, that individual students and faculty are, in fact, in the same position relative to speech. We know that some individuals are more able to speak than others, and thus they have power. Second, I think this point builds off the last, and it is what constitutes political speech and what constitutes the university. Much of the report is focused on protecting the political speech of the individual professor and student, suggesting that the university should not engage in political speech. However, I contend that the university engages in different forms of political speech all the time. For example, when we named the economics department the Kenneth C. Griffin Department of Economics, for me, that is in fact political speech, given we know Mr. Griffin's demonstrated commitment to funding conservative and right-wing causes and politicians. I don't think we would have named it the George Soros Department of Economics, but I probably would also have a problem with that, right? So to suggest that the university is not involved in political speech, I think is inaccurate and happens all the time. Third and finally, I think we need a document that delineates our values. What does the university stand for and stand behind in addition to free speech? Throughout Kalven, there is a reference to the university's social values, but yet there is no complementary report generated by a faculty committee in consultation with the university community that tries to detail what values actually shape our work and that we believe in. There's much more to say. I know you have a second and third question, so I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for inviting me. You probably gathered that it wasn't my book on Descartes. Thank you for that plug. That got me here. But I'm the faculty director of the Parousia Program for Public Discourse in the college, and so have been thinking about some of these issues for quite a while. Although I want to stress, and I think this is a bit important, it is important also for what I want to say about the Kalven Report and generally our long the tradition with the issue of academic freedom of free speech is that I come to this not like some of my colleagues, so to say, as a scholar, as my area of expertise. I came to it because I was an alternate for the committee, and I always forget the ugly title of the Committee on University Discipline for Disruptive Conduct. And one of the things that became clear in the work of the committee, that started out, by the way, before Trump was elected, and no one cared what we were doing, and when we sent out emails to talk to faculty and students, we got a miserable response rate, and then in the course of our work, Trump got elected, and suddenly everyone was interested in what we were doing. And what became clear in that is that we lack an educational component, that we are not, that we put out principles and all sorts of reports, but we don't really have these kind of conversations, and particularly in the classroom and with our students, but of course also with our colleagues. I also want to say, so I have spent, in the context of this committee work, quite a bit of time also with, our, so to say, canonical documents, although I'm hate this term. I should also say that I always like the Kalven Report much more than the Chicago Principles. I think it's a report that just gives you more to work with, even though it is, of course, highly problematical. So Cathy, of course, has gone over a number of things that I wanted to talk about, and you have done it probably much more eloquently than I would have. So let me start maybe with some of the things that I appreciate about the Kalven Report. And one that I want to say is an unfulfilled project, namely that the university is, and this will not surprise you given my, so to say, background, is a parrhesiastic institution, is configured, i.e. An institution of critique. I think we tend to forget that when we read the Kalven Report, that it really celebrates critique. And I'm glad that we are, so to say, bending the critique back on to the Kalven Report. But I'm not sure that that's something that we, particularly in the discussions about free speech, is something that we really are mindful. The other thing that I also want to stress is the foreground of academic freedom. When I talk about free speech, coming from being trained originally in a very different tradition, namely the German tradition, I try to sort of, shift the conversation more towards academic freedom than really the First Amendment, which tends to, first of all, of course, be much more quickly politicized, but it also means that the Kalven Report limits the freedom that when it comes to speech, inquiry, et cetera, to one that is academic. And that's another thing, again, that of course raises a whole of other different questions, but I think it's important to stress, something that the Chicago Principles seems to sort of give up by, again, more invoking, so to say, the absolute freedom of speech rather than one that is constrained through a number of contexts, codes, settings, et cetera. About the limitations, Cathy has already touched on many of them. I think the most important one would be sort of the naivete about neutrality and access. Obviously neutrality is not possible, so to say, but that doesn't, of course, mean that we should not work towards it. We should be vigilant about it. I don't see any other alternative to it, but that at the same time we need to recognize that particularly in a highly complex institution with multiple actors, there is going to be many different motives at work, agendas at work, et cetera. And so neutrality is, so to say, a kind of regulative fiction that we can strive towards, but that we're not achieve. One of the things that we thought a lot about in that aforementioned committee is also that, and we called what the neutrality, we talked about in that report about a kind of free speech commons, and we discussed extensively the asymmetries in that and the power that structures a free speech commons, and that one has to be cognizant of, and that we, again, when we talk about it in terms of neutrality, that and access and so to say unfettered access, we tend to overlook. And I'll leave it at there for a moment.
Thanks very much.
So I'm the Calvinist on this panel, nail something to the door. I guess sorry. I mixed up my Protestant history. Shows what I know. I'm a scholar of constitutional law, and I think of the Calvin as constitutional. I want to distinguish the free speech stuff, which is the Chicago Principles, from Calvin. Calvin basically says the university isn't going to speak on the issues of the day. That's it in a nutshell. The free speech stuff is different, and maybe I'll come back to that. But on Calvin, we tend to use the term Calvin because of this 1967 report. It actually is a principle that goes back to the beginning of the university. It was adopted in 1899 in almost a democratic way. There was this body called the Congregation, which included all the senior faculty, all senior administrators, and everyone who'd ever obtained a PhD by that point, which I don't know how many people that was. And they were the ones who said, we're going to have free speech here, we're always going to have free speech, and the university as such does not appear as a disputant on either side upon any public question. And this was designed, of course, to protect academic freedom, because at that time you had donors, which was the major threat then, and now, you know, yeah, exactly, well, there's lots of threats. We have the state now. That's an even worse threat than donors rising in this country. It is, as Cathy said, extremely critical time, so it is important for us to get this right. But at that time, the idea was that the university isn't going to speak precisely so that everyone in it could speak and the university could distance itself. Harper could say, there's a communist over here, that's fine. Not us, it's not us speaking. So that's the idea, it's to protect academic freedom. And the alternative, of course, in our era is what we have seen in recent years, which I actually consider to be part of the corporate university, which is university leaders in a kind of neoliberal way speaking out and saying, I'm for this, I'm not for that. It's part of their brands. We have done that sometimes, but generally speaking, don't, and I think that's good. Because those university leader statements are always pretty vacuous. They empirically have very little effect, and I can talk a little bit about that. And the ones that you see, you know, I study international law, there's a selection process. We saw many, many university presidents telling us that Vladimir Putin was a monster for the invasion of Ukraine. We saw no one talking about the comparable violence in Ethiopia or Sudan, Yemen, which was, you know, with some American support and such. So there's always this partial political process, and Calvin protects us. This is where the constitutional point comes in. By saying we're taking the president's voice off the table. I sometimes say we think so little of our president, we don't let him speak for us. We are basically channeling our energy into talking and being able to speak and debate about all these issues and questions. And the alternative is the president can speak for all of us, and that unleashes a process, which we see in many universities, of people lobbying to get their preferred statement, you know, issued by the president. And that lobbying process is going to favor the powerful. Calvin protects the people who are not powerful. If you think you're likely to win all these university battles, then you don't like Calvin. If you think you're not, you should like Calvin. Keeps the university quiet. It's neutrality. Yeah, okay. So this is getting about Calvin. I don't think the exception is very well drafted. You know, it was a committee document. Jamie Calvin's here, and he's done a lot of work on how they fought a lot about the exception, because there is an exception. The university doesn't speak unless it does. And that's the difficult thing. And when do they do so, when do they not? You know, I know one issue is, you know, in honorary degrees, convocation speakers Lisa raised with us, you know, so you know, that doesn't, there are times when the university will speak in its corporate capacity, et cetera. I find that to be nicer if it was clear, because then we would have a better grounds to debate as a community when we want the university to speak and when we don't. But as it is, it's not perfect. I'm not so worried about the word neutrality. I know that, you know, because it's a semiotic like all of these things, and you could call it schmootrality, you could call it institutional restraint, which is what Diermeyer has adopted, which is basically, it's a mood. We're not going to speak out until we do. And I'd like to have some clearer principles about exactly when those exceptions are and how far it extends. I want to say one other very brief thing, which is that the issue of speech, you know, is a totally different thing. It's another semiotic. We don't really mean free speech in the university. I can't go teach nuclear physics in my law class. You can't get up, if you're a student in my class, and start yelling about some political issue. We use free speech in the political sphere. And in the political sphere, you don't need a listener. But in a university, it's really about conversation. It's really about structuring an environment. And so in that, I agree with Cathy that we need to really work hard It doesn't happen automatically. It's going to take a lot of work, and I don't know that we've done a great job of it so far in this university. We're good at the keeping out of things, but the building the affirmative environment, that's serious work. So that's what we all have to work on.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question, and then I do want to hear each of your responses, and if you want to respond to each other for a bit, and then we will open it up, as I promised. And so this question, I hope, gets to some of the controversies at the heart of the report. Some colleagues, students, and staff decry the report's claims to neutrality, which we've just been talking about. The criticisms in this vein are often two-pronged, aspects of which you've all touched upon, but let me bring it into bold relief. One prong has to do with the selective enforcement, that is, that the university uses the report or is often attacked for using the report as an alibi to promote its own political agenda or as cover to take down statements of solidarity it's uncomfortable with, or to take that recent example as a way to invite convocation speakers whose politics are deeply problematic for much of the university community. And the other prong of this neutrality issue has to do with the fact that investments are rarely neutral, and we haven't touched on this yet. So calls for divestment are calls to divest from funds or multinational businesses that are fundamentally political, such as fossil fuel companies or ones involved in weapons manufacturing. And let's talk about each prong of this criticism, namely selective enforcement and the impossibility of neutrality, but particularly around investments. Cathy?
I find, if you think about the purpose of the Kalven Report as being to allow us to have our conversation and to speak out, investment's kind of orthogonal to that. Right? The university's got to get some money, it does it in some way. And so you could say that it doesn't sort of fit the core purposes. It has been interpreted here as being that the Kalven Report prohibits the university from divesting for political reasons and such. And I think that the rationale is that if we were to divest, it would be simply as trying to make a statement. We would be, as a university, saying we're not going to invest in fossil fuels, we're going to pull out of Darfur, that was an issue earlier and such, so that all we're doing there is making a statement. Now, for complex reasons I don't have time to go into, most divestment is not actually effective in terms of, something like the fossil fuel industry where there's a world market for oil. Our purifying ourselves by divesting is not going to make a bit of difference. The oil, the stocks are going to, be cheaper and more people will buy them and so on. It's very hard to actually influence things. And so it's a matter of effectiveness and efficacy, I think, when it comes to that realm. Yeah, and then the other thing is that these exceptions and such, and I'm sorry you didn't like my convocation speech, Lisa, just last year, but yeah, I think what's really going on there is that and I'm not an administrator, I don't even know how these speakers get chosen. I hear you making a plea for more faculty involvement in who gets to speak. And that seems perfectly plausible to me. There's no reason, who we invite to make speeches and such like that. We do have faculty involvement on who we give honorary degrees to. And that's what I hear you saying, I think. But I'm not sure that I would change the Kalven Report in the sense that we're going to invite people with positions. And just because we invite someone doesn't mean we're endorsing them. That's the core point. Simply by providing space does not mean the university endorses a speaker. The alternative would be that the university would have to vet every single person who anyone invites to see if they wanted to endorse them. It's a decentralized community where we invite ordinary speakers. When it comes to convocation speeches, that's a centralized process, and it seems to me that could be governed in a more democratic way.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree to a certain extent with Tom on the divestment issue. And I'm not sure that that's what worries me. Cathy, in her opening statement, mentioned a number of other areas that I'm much more worried about, and we see it, of course, also right now in the recent congressional hearing, and then the board of very activist board of trustees, very activist alumni and donors. I think that's where there is much more direct and problematical impact or influence on a kind of neutrality or restraint. So the divestment, one way to think about this is, again, is to think about, if this is about, if the freedom that the Kalven Report contemplates pertains mainly to research and teaching, the investment, of course, is not primarily there to make a political statement. It's, it's for, to make the endowment grow rather than something else. Now, I'm fully aware that, nothing is free of politics, but at the same time, it's the act of divestment that actually creates the political statement, not necessarily, or the stronger political statement, the more overt. But as I said, I tend to be less worried about it. We're also worried about that the endowment growth at the University of Chicago is anemic, and that may just as much impact our ability to do things than the question of divestment. I agree with that. I have been on the inside as an administrator when I was as a college deputy dean and master. So I have a little bit of insight how this works with the commencement speakers, but I also agree that there could be a better process. I would be a little bit distrustful that there is, so to say, and I know, Lisa, you didn't mean it that way. You're channeling, so to say, the criticism, but that there is a deliberate attempt to to bring in certain speakers that reflect the university leadership, but not others. These things happen, are often much more circumstantial. It happens that certain alumni, are available and et cetera. What I'm trying to say is that this decision making isn't always as intentional and deliberate and unified as we would like to have it. Now, I also I personally am also highly or feel always very uncomfortable about this very let me call it to a certain extent unreflexive willingness to invite speakers that are controversial and then basically just simply to go through with it. I think, as Tom has mentioned, I think we are, we need to have better conversations in the forefront so that we don't have conflict afterwards. And so in that sense, but at the same time, once we have invited a speaker, I think it's very problematic to disinvite them. And that doesn't mean that we always have to invite them just for the purpose of, having, so to say, celebrating free speech. But any case, that's yeah.
I'm going to be brief, and I want to be because I want an engagement. And I think I'll start first of all with the kind of selective enforcement. I worry deeply about the trend that we have seen at this university of the selective enforcement and weaponization of Kalven. And I got permission from Gina, so I can say, for example, I know that the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture had a statement about the murder of Tyree Nichols, reinforcing our understanding of his humanity and grieving his murder. Goes back to Butler's, who's grievable, right? And they were ordered to take down the statement by the provost's office or people in the provost's office. I know that there have been people who have produced land acknowledgments, and they were told to take down their statements. Statements on the war in Ukraine. And the idea supposedly is that all of this is being pursued toward the chilling effect that is produced when the university speaks, this is to Tom's point, right, on political issues. But for me, it raises this question, who stands in for the university? Again, it goes back to the problem of only thinking about free speech. First of all, at the individual level for faculty and students, never staff, so let's think about that. Again, marginalized communities, as someone who, I know the importance of collective thinking, action, mobilization, so to only protect speech at the individual level worries me, right? And so it does raise the question, and again, I'm not saying that in fact there are answers, I'm saying that the Kalven Report raises important questions that have to be engaged through a new process, right? Does a center stand for the university? Is a department a university? And what does it mean not to protect the free speech of staff? There's also, I think, the chilling effect not only of speech, but non-speech. What does it mean or say if the world watched and reacted to the murder of George Floyd, and no entity, even those whose intellectual projects are rooted in and aligned with the discussion of topics of race and policing and murder, said nothing, right? It feels like this is a time when, in fact, no speech is also chilling. Again, I'm not saying that I have an answer. I'm saying that these are critical questions that have to be engaged. All right, one last point, and that is about investments. And what do we mean when we say the university? Devarian Baldwin has written a really important book called In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. And in the book, he reminds us that universities are no longer or primarily what we think of as teaching and research units across divisions or arts and sciences. He reminds us that we have produced what he calls universities that provide employment, medical care, housing, schooling, policing for larger and larger areas and cities, right? On the south side of Chicago. So to think that we cannot, first of all, to think that there is neutrality in investment from an entity like that is naive, right? And so the question becomes, how does one produce a governance structure that allows faculty, staff, students, whomever, to have some say, some process for reviewing, and some control over the growing corporate university that is the University of Chicago and so many other entities, right? And so for me, Kalven raises the question of who speaks for the university. What do we even mean by the university? Because I think we often think about this little sliver when it's this big, big entity. And it raises for me a deep question about governance and the power of, I dare say, faculty to hold a university accountable that has all of its power put in the Board of Trustees. So when we believe, in fact, that the provost's office is weaponizing Kalven, what do we do? And all we can do is ask the provost's office, who we think is weaponizing Kalven, to stop it, right? The council, the committee of the council, has very little power. That is just the truth of the matter. And so, you know, for me, what is called for in Kalven is a reconsideration of these ideas in 2024, 1967. It is not the same University of Chicago. And I just think that is the call for Kalven. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Before we open it up, are there any points that any of you made that you would like to take up with one another before I open it up to the audience?
One thing, which Cathy said, I have a bunch of them, but I don't
Yeah,
wanna
yeah,
take
me
all
too.
of them. Cathy and I would talk. Oh, no. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to mention something about hate speech, which is obviously appalling. No one likes hate speech. The fact is, we are in the United States.
Some
where,
do, but okay.
Well, yes,
Yeah,
that's
yes.
true. Yeah, right. I mean, so this, and also the staff issue. So, you know, the United States is in general an at-will employment thing. You know, someone, employee of Coca-Cola goes and trashes Coca-Cola, they'd be fired. You know, this is just the background conditions we're working in. We should criticize those, and we should facilitate as much as possible the experience of free expression for our staff, I think. And we hope to do some of that with the forum, because we think it's valuable for everyone to have the opportunity. But the fact is, we have these background conditions. Hate speech, I've looked at a little bit in other constitutional systems. And, you know, probably if we had a survey here, should we change the First Amendment to prohibit hate speech, we'd pass that constitutional amendment. When you look at how those things are implemented in countries that do have them, it's not pretty. In fact, just this week, going to where we started, Germany is using the hate speech laws to prohibit pro-Palestinian demonstrations. France tried to shut them down. It was ineffective. So it's always the question of who is the regulator. You know, it sounds good on paper to prohibit these things. Obviously, if we could wave a wand and always have a good regulator, we would do that. But we can't. And so there's this kind of distrust. And I do worry, even at a level of a university, that we would always have the good provost's office, to use the example you gave, and such. And so this kind of sort of sense of distrust and preserving the ability of the individual and group to dissent is super important. And that's the tradition, I think.
I totally understand what you are saying, and I said about 7 times, it's not against free speech, but it's anyway. But I think, in fact, we also have to take seriously our commitment and responsibility to create spaces, in fact, where all students can learn, right? Amen. And if that is also an equal, and I would argue twin, goal of the university, or a twin responsibility to protecting free speech for, right? We often say free speech, but we don't say for. Free speech for the production of knowledge that contributes to a bettering society. That is what we're supposed to be doing, not just protecting speech. Then the question is, what is a process through which we can take seriously the production of harm from speech and think with all the brilliant people here at the University of Chicago, is there an infrastructure? Are there ways in which we might, in fact, train faculty to actually teach being cognizant of both speech and harm, right? So I guess I reject the offhanded kind of idea, well, in fact, we can't protect each other or anyone from hate speech. Look what they're doing in Germany. They're doing it incorrectly. I think there are kind of middle grounds to your point about kind of spaces of consideration, thought, and innovation where we can start to think about how does one create, for example, classrooms where, in fact, we believe in speech, but we also believe, and I don't dare say the word safety, but the idea that, in fact, we might minimize harm so that students actually can engage in difficult ideas and exchange across kind of positions, right? I worry sometimes that this kind of allegiance to free speech misses the point of the way in which it's implemented in a way that is productive, right? And paying attention to the differences through which all of us come into this question of this kind of arena of free speech with different kind of resources and access to power. It's not the same for everyone.
I don't disagree at all. I think that's exactly right. That's called good teaching. And it's called including every single student in your classroom. And this is beyond simply race and gender and social stratification, which we know exists. Getting every student, whether they're shy, wherever they're coming from, to have the experience of expressing themselves and to dialogue. That's what we're here for. And as I said before, it's a semiotic to use free speech. That's good, but it's not really what we're after. So I think we don't disagree, Cathy, but let's see what else others.
Let's see, I'm sure we will. Can I ask one question? Because in a number of times you've talked about the university and we wouldn't want the university to speak, and you've always referenced the president, right? So I'll agree. I don't want the president, the provost, no offense, Amanda, the deans, that's my dean over here, right, to speak for us if that is the university. I do want the Race Center to speak. I do want kind of a proliferation of different types of positions and ideas and communities across the campus to be able to speak and to represent their communities that they've established, right?
Yes.
So I think we have to differentiate. Who do we mean when we say we don't want the university? What constitutes the university? Okay, let's go ahead.
No, to me, the worst offender is actually the department level, because a department controls tenure, controls access to graduate student funds. If a department takes a stand on Ukraine or Israel or something like that, what they're saying is there's one position here, and you better toe that line and don't question, don't even inquire. It's a discouragement of inquiring after these things, and I think that's where power actually lies. No one pays much attention to the provost or president, what they say.
That's where power actually lies. You have never been a department
And I
chair.
don't
I can
plan on
trust
it.
you.
I don't plan on it.
That
plan
is
on
not
it.
where power lies. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't plan on it.
Departments don't even control tenure. It can be rejected by the provost and the president and the, you know what I mean?
But
Yeah,
you get the
yes.
point that it's the line place where people are thinking about what to look at and what, people, junior people, do experience departments as places with power. So.
Okay, I think this is a fantastic conversation, and one thing I'm hearing here is in Cathy's comments also an appreciation for a kind of polyvocality that, say, centers give us, that is tamped down or muted in unsalutary ways by the Kalven Report's championing of neutrality. And then I hear you, Tom, saying as well that it's important for us to think about ways to cultivate educative flourishing through a kind of more intense intellectual debate with faculty governance, say. I'm hearing everybody say faculty governance being reclaimed, and with maybe more student input into that kind of governance, and also without ignoring staff, which is actually not, that the category of staff is not mentioned, if memory serves, in the Kalven Report, which is a major problem. So with those things in mind, let's open it up a bit and forgive the crudeness of the summary or the compression of the summary and take some questions here. So how about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to start?
You're like 5. I think you're 5.
We need the mic, I'm sorry.
Could you ask people to introduce themselves?
Yes, would you mind also introducing yourselves as you speak?
Yeah, Kaushik Sundararajan, Anthropology. Thank you all so much for your presentation. So this isn't in any way an argument with it, but an attempt to sort of push you on a couple of dimensions, right? And first of all, I'm interested in, Lisa and Cathy, where you started about the current conjuncture of sort of a chilling effect on free speech that makes us want to defend the values in the Kalven Report. And I think about this in relation to, I think the last time the 3CT and other centers organized a conversation on free speech, which was in the aftermath of the Trump election, when what was happening was a weaponization of hate speech in the name of free speech. And so what this suggests to me is a kind of tension between free speech and academic freedom as absolute goods and as situated goods, where under certain circumstances it becomes more urgent to fight for them, and in certain circumstances it becomes more urgent to temper them. So I'm wondering how you sort of think about that tension between the absolute and situated dimensions. And Tom, my way of phrasing that to you would be, if we were to think of the Kalven Report as a constitutional document, how do we use it as a living constitution rather than as something that gets invoked in a sort of textualist or originalist sense? And I want to tie that specifically, and this is the second point, to the conjuncture of the corporatization of the university, and ask you all to reflect a little bit more on how you think about that, because I think this isn't just about things like donor influence. Tom, as you said, that's an 1899 problem, right? So for me, the issue is not so much that Ken Griffin gets to have a department or a school named after him, but that in this conjuncture, universities' financial viability depends upon the Ken Griffins of the world getting to have departments and schools named after them.
Yes,
And
yes.
so if we could just push a little bit on the conjuncture of corporatization and what that's doing for academic.
Please respond.
Yeah.
You get to respond.
you go
Can we
fir-
have the
you wanna
mic?
go
You go
first?
first. No. You.
Oh, just super quickly, living constitution. Yeah, of course, this is a tradition. This is a tradition that dates back to 1899. Every generation talks about these principles. We work it out, and we come to we're confronting new problems all the time. We have really new problems now. We have the social media. We have the return of state power to regulate academic freedom, to pressure us, which we haven't seen since McCarthy in this level. I mean, it's a real crisis. I want to go back to Cathy's point when she started. And it's incumbent on us to meet that challenge and and to adjust over time. So maybe that's all I'll say. It keeps in the interest of having others answer.
I mean, can I just?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're doing it right now. I mean, one of the things when you start looking into the history of these reports and committees is that, and I remember the same on the committee, that we all thought our work was just preliminary. And then, of course, very quickly it sort of solidifies, and we treat these as texts that somehow, like the Shills report. I mean, these are very imperfect documents, and they're documents that have to, as Cathy stressed, this is a document from 1967, and we're in 2024. And for instance, harm. I was going to mention social media, whatnot. I mean, there's. You can come up with all sorts of other things that are not contemplated by the Kalven Report, and so we need to have these conversations. That's why I agreed to be here, because I think we need to have it, and so that's one thing that I would say is that and we need to lean on the documents very hard.
I'll just, yeah. Anyway, I guess I want to make sure that everyone understands that I'm not suggesting that there are clear lines and easy yes and no's and right answers. So maybe to your point, Tom, I actually think this is some of the most difficult work that we will engage in, right? Which is trying to, in movement spaces, people talk about trying to hold two things together that seem to be in opposition, but that in fact, if you can think your way through how to hold them together, take you much further than pushing one and ignoring the other. And I think this question, and I was perplexed earlier as I was trying to kind of write these comments because, and I see Elaine out there, I was thinking about the work we did around Steve Bannon. And the reasoning that we put forth for why we did not want Steve Bannon to come to campus, but at the same time trying to protect the idea of speech, right? Like what types of speech should be protected, right? This was this kind of argument about kind of reasonable evidence-based speech. Should all speech be protected? So Tom, I guess what I'm saying is I feel like we are at a moment, because we are yet at another crisis, right, where speech is being curtailed across campuses and students are being arrested on this campus, right, because in fact we have not deeply engaged in a sustained community thought process about how to deal with harm and how to protect speech. And maybe the idea is that that is not possible, but I think there is progress to be made there. I think to your question about, it is, and I think you're right, that it's not just the naming of the econ department, but the fact that the university only will continue to exist in many ways because of the naming of the econ department and many other departments, right? When you read my bio, I have a name chair, which comes with money for the university, right? We might think of all of those contributions as a form of speech, right, that goes uncontrolled, that is unaccountable, and is largely unseen to most people within the university, right? When we say, here is my title, we don't say that costs so much money to have this title. That doesn't come back to us, but it does in terms of the provision of certain types of resources for the work that we do as a university. So, I mean, part of how we might think about this is there is a kind of debate over speech that is legible and easily seen. And there is a lot of powerful speech that happens to which we are never privy to. And so the question is, what is the impact of the Kalven Report on that type of, I dare say, economic speech that propels the university, that has always propelled the university? And so to this question of donors. And I think it also makes legible really the power of donors, right? Again, we come to this idea that not all speech is equal, and that certain players who have a relationship to the university, who have financial means, can have more access, more power, more speech. And this leads us back, I think, to governance, to say, how do we reflect on that, control that, engage with that? So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. The next
Oops,
speaker,
that was only one
and then Dara in the back afterwards.
Who was it?
Yeah.
Two.
Yes.
Elaine.
Elaine, I'm sorry.
It's all right, I had my mask
apologies,
on. Hi, I'm Elaine Hadley. I teach in the English department. Two things I just wanted to say quickly. I'm a little concerned about our naivete. I think Cathy used this word earlier. It's kind of taking my breath away a little bit, actually. And in two instances. One is the idea that even in the level of the free speech component of a Kalven Report, where we celebrate the ability for each of us in this community to trade ideas. Chris, you said something about we're doing it now. Well, I'm increasingly feeling like these scenes of conversation are performative branding. That the university, upper echelon of the university, will take this moment through your center, through other elements, and put it in a brochure. But what can we do about things that we think are going seriously wrong? As a faculty, as a staff, there's nothing we can do, okay? Second form of naivete is, I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, I may have gotten it wrong. You said something about investing is neutral,
I didn't.
but divesting is political. And there was another reference that divesting doesn't work. So I should reveal I'm one of the faculty members who's been deeply involved in the fossil fuel divestment effort. And I think one of the things we do too much at this university is we're confused by the extent to which we have unconsciously incorporated a certain form of economic thinking about how things work or don't work. In fact, divestment, if we use the measure of whether it works or not, we should get rid of our whole diversity program. Because as far as I notice, there's still racism in the university. There's still racism in the country. It's not been effective. Should we throw it out the window? Divestment can be effective if a lot of places do it. And if powerful places with a lot of authority do it, like Harvard did in a way. It's not perfect, it's messy, you know, but it's not the kind of obvious fail that a certain kind of economic formulation of it argues that it is. And I feel very much like when we sit around and congratulate ourselves, and I'm loving this conversation, so don't get me wrong, but when we congratulate ourselves about it, we're missing the fact that it does absolutely nothing. Like, we can't go to the university and say, change this, change that. I was in the university council for a bazillion years. We were lucky if we could say something about the letterhead with effectiveness. In fact, I was in the committee of the council for a year, and we spent 2 meetings on letterhead. I'm not kidding you, 2 meetings on letterhead. So these are the things I'm wondering about. It's like, are we really, when we talk about free speech, and we congratulate ourselves because we didn't have the mess that Columbia did, but we're kind of ignoring the internal power structures that have established the rules at this university that have created a performance of free speech, but underneath that, all kinds of limitations of free speech. And then I don't think that investing is politically neutral, but divesting is political. I just think that's a really, there's more to be said about that. So, thank you.
Does anybody want to respond?
I could say something.
Why don't you
I
start?
wanna say
Very
something last.
quickly, I mean, on the faculty governance side, I don't
Yes.
have any involvement in that. But one critical point about our country as compared with others is that faculty and staff are, well, faculty certainly are protected by academic freedom when they criticize their administration. That's not true everywhere, but it's a critical component. So that is something that at least we do have. In terms of congratulating ourselves, I definitely don't do that. I really am committed to what Cathy's describing about an environment in which, we've been good at the lack of repression. We haven't been good at building the affirmative environment in which people can talk across difference and exchange them. That takes so much work. So that's what I'm hoping to spend my next few years working on, but it's definitely not easy. I don't want to say anything else about the faculty governance. I don't know much about it.
Oh, you want to go? I'll just go very quickly. So, Tom, here's what I would quibble with, which is I think faculty are protected from being fired, but not from being dismissed, not from not getting raises, not from not being put on important committees. I mean, there's a whole range of ways in which the university can exert retribution. So that's one thing. Elaine, I keep talking. First of all, Elaine is my neighbor. I'm so happy she's here. So this is what I meant about people who know this as well as we do or better. I keep talking about governance as a way to think about are faculty ready to kind of, I don't want to say reclaim the university, but at least do organizing from a position of understanding their depleted power at this university. And maybe for me that means one way is to think about not just what is governance, but what would be effective governance in terms of redistributing power at the university. And the last thing I'll just say is I think the reason I've suggested I can't believe I'm at the point where I'm asking for another committee and a report, right? A report, I have truly been here too long. But a report on values, because I think in fact that provides us with another standard by which we judge success. Right, so when we think about divestment, it is not only in terms of the immediate kind of return, but the moral stance and what in fact you're showing to other universities, to other communities, to other bodies. So I think there are kind of many different pieces here that we need to pay attention to, in particular governance, organizing, and a statement of values.
I think you have been here too long. No, I'm just kidding because the committee. I'm not sure that the committee is the right way to do this.
Okay.
I mean, you raised the question: who speaks for the university and for the. I just wanted to. I mean, I didn't, Elaine. I wasn't particularly eloquent on that, but I wasn't trying to say that investment is neutral. I was just trying to, caution immediately making into political statement. And it can, of course. I'm not saying that you can make an argument, but you do not have to. Whereas divestment is going to be then a political statement. That's what I was trying to say, and I'm not. I was trying to criticize neutrality, as you heard. I completely agree with you that I think, and Tom has heard me say this, and I know that he we just heard a disclaimer from him, but I do also, obviously free speech has become a part of the brand and of the university. I admit that I trade on it, but I also think that at the same time in what I do, but at the same time, again, only because it has become a brand doesn't mean that, so to say, it's wrong because it's a brand, obviously. So the problem is more, as we have been now discussing and as you have been discussing, is governance, is the fact that that I think a lot of people perceive, a profound hypocrisy between the professions of free speech on the one hand, and sort of the utter powerlessness that they feel in all practical things. And obviously that's, so I don't, the branding is okay if we live up to it. And obviously there is, we can look at this in all sorts of ways. One of the ways that I have, been very much affected is that we are all, that we're all supposedly management in all sorts of contexts, and yet I think very few of us, I'm a department chair right now, I feel I'm managing anything of importance or and of impact. So
Can I say one little thing? Are you done?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry to hog the floor, but I want to come back a little bit to this idea of harm, and if we want to avoid harm. I teach international law. I teach about Israel and Palestine. I talk about it all the time. If you're overly worried about harm, you're not going to say much. It's a very sensitive subject, as we know, and it's a critical one. It's part of our free speech crisis. It's not the only thing that's going on now. Now, my view about the way this is actually playing out on campuses is what I call surplus powerlessness. We actually have, no side actually feels like they're being heard. And that sounds like what is true in the university context as well. There's suppression, of course, or people feel suppressed. But it is the case that we are not doing that core work, which I keep coming back to, of actually providing an environment to facilitate conversations on these very tough issues. If we were able to do that, people would feel empowered. If we can provide that context. We haven't started that, really. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you. Dara?
Hey, thank you all for this very illuminating panel. I'm Dara Grant. I teach in the college. I'm another category that doesn't get talked a lot, an other academic appointee, so in but not of the faculty handbook. The protections are certainly less robust than they're going to be for everybody else, given that we have to be regularly. Well, not all of us have a union, actually. But all of which is just to say that some of us have to be regularly reappointed, and the chilling effect of regular reappointment might be considerably greater than most things. The point that I want to bring up, though, is a point about naivete. And I will say I broadly share Lisa and Cathy's view that the Kalven Report was never something that I would imagine myself having been a champion of, and yet the idea of it not existing is also pretty terrifying. But there is something naive about the university assuming that defending the Kalven Report isn't itself going to be a political position that the university has to take. That is to say, that precisely the forces of the state that want to threaten universities, fire university presidents, discipline students, have them chucked off campus, fire faculty for positions they take on publicly resonant issues, to take up a position against that is going to have to be political. And if, as soon as we enter into that realization that the defense of the Kalven Report is taking up a political stand, then the Kalven Report loses its own foundations. It simply turns into a little bit of plain nonsense. And we have to sort of either be willing to stand on our own feet and assert that as an institution, we are going to agree to take political positions sometimes, or we're going to have to just wait for them to come for us and do nothing in response when those forces are ranged against us, and they are going to be ranged against us. And so it seems to me that, something about what the Kalven Report is aiming at was of a piece with its own historical moment, and that is not our moment. And if we're going to have a principle on which we stand, it cannot be that one. It can't be a principle of an aspiration to neutrality.
So, Dara, I think Tom and I are looking for the same thing, the exception, which says from time to time, instances will arise in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry, and allows the university under those circumstances, according to Kalven, to take what you would be considering, and I think you're right, a political stance in defense of, in this case, Kalven or free speech, right? So the exemption is there already in the document. But I think it maybe underscores your interpretation of the work of supporting Kalven as a political statement. Now, for me, the question is, what are the conditions under which the mission is threatened? right? There are all these opportunities in Calvin with very little definition. And I think that becomes a kind of space for debate, disagreement, discussion. What threatens the mission of a university? I could name many things that probably the administration would not agree. Yeah.
But I think we all agree, of course, if the Kalven Report had specified all those conditions, it would not, we would probably just not read it anymore now.
Would we not read it? I think that's,
Or we
I
would
mean,
read
I'm
it
not
as-
asking the Kalven Report to specify every condition. I'm saying that there has to be a kind of re-engagement with Calvin periodically, given the kind of changing context and conditions of society. And so the mission that was understood in 1967 of the university, again, this goes back to Devarian's work, is a very different mission of the university and even how we understand what the university is in 2024, right?
Right. I mean, one of the things, and you may know this as you can read it in John Boyer's account of the Kalven Report, is the special, the appendix by Stiegler.
Yes.
The Kalven Report actually goes more in the direction that we are now wanting to push it than Stiegler was,
Steve wanted,
and that was really, imagining a almost strict neutrality.
Maybe we should, do you all see what this is? Tom, this is your thing, but I love the title. I don't know who gave him the right, but it says the Chicago Canon. According to whom, I don't know, but yes. You want to explain what it is?
On the spot. This is just a volume that we put out for the launch of the Chicago Forum. We're pleased to announce there's going to be a University of Chicago Press edition, thanks to Elizabeth Branch Dyson here, coming out in the fall. And it's basically these reports, as well as some of the great statements, Chris's recent aims of education speech and other things that constitute our tradition for us to wrestle with as we live with a history, an institution with a history. And doesn't mean that the history, it has to be a living tradition, let me put it that way. I want to say one very brief thing.
Gabriel's beautiful aims of
Gabriel's
education is also in there.
fantastic.
Yeah.
One very brief thing, which is just to point out that in our national crisis on academic freedom, the adjunctification, which is a national trend, is a huge problem.
Exactly.
Massive problem.
Exactly.
And that's the corporate university.
Okay, so I believe you were next. My apologies. Yeah. Right here. Thank you. Mark.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about, I know Professors Ginsburg and Wild, you were saying that in many ways investment, even if it is a political voice, it's sort of a softer political voice than divestment would be. But I want to sort of put a sharper point on how much louder of a political voice this university's in particular investment can be. So for instance, we didn't divest from apartheid South Africa far after the majority of other institutions had, which I believe would be pretty clearly a political position in favor of apartheid. Or, for instance, Amnesty International recently did a report on our endowment where we scored 0 out of 40 on human rights concerns, which, side note, really hasn't come to any financial benefit to us because our endowment isn't doing well, but distinguishes us from the other major financial endowments across this country. We're the only university that scored so low, and so that, to me, also seems to be a pretty clear political point in favor of a certain view of human rights concerns. And so I know we've talked a lot about faculty governance as a way to sort of mediate these difficult questions of neutrality, but I'm also interested in both community governance in the sense that this university as a university has had like a profound and deleterious impact on the Southside community, and then also transparency, the extent to which, to use your word, Professor Wild, we can't turn parousia on this own university because we have no idea what they're really doing with their finances.
Well said. We're doing bad on every dimension. That's really something. That's a hard thing to do.
Nice job, Mark.
Look, I struggle with this. I'm not an expert on investment policy. I do think that, if you really follow the neutrality thing, then we should probably disinvest from ESG funds, those kind of investment instruments which are trying to do well by doing good and such. And I don't know that anyone's talking about that. I just think it's an area where, you know, I'm not sure I want it determined by a community vote, though. I'm not sure I want the investments to be made by democracy, because that might by a democratic process, a truly democratic process where we're all voting on it. I don't think that might make us feel better, but we might do even worse, is all I know. So it's just an observation on your well-taken comments.
You don't trust the people.
I do trust the people, but not about
You don't
that.
trust the educated people who have been educated
trust-
at the
I-
university.
yeah. I
Wow,
trust the
Tom,
experts.
Tom, okay. He called you up.
Well, look, I mean, we're discussing the question of divestment or investment and divestment in connection with the obviously Kalven Report. You know, it's obviously a separate question in itself that we should be discussing, and the Kalven Report also, you know, contemplates that in the sense of that it calls for critique, criticism, protest, et cetera, et cetera. So it's and I share. You know, it becomes, of course, problematical when, you know, that conversation is shut down basically by saying, you know, we're neutral and so we shouldn't have the conversation. We need to have the conversation. Whether then neutrality at the end might be an argument to not do A or B, that's another matter. But, you know, shutting down the conversation because we're invoking the Kalven Report is obviously contravening the Kalven Report.
I hear a tension among the speakers between the idea of neutrality as a good to be strived for, and neutrality as, you know, something that in situated circumstances might work well, but is otherwise not only naive, but also rides roughshod over prevailing power relationships in ways that might undermine conversation about faculty governance and other kinds of intellectual flourishing. Is that a fair account of the tension here?
I mean, I would say that like neutrality, like truth, is an imperfect but kind of necessary ideal. Obviously, you can call it what you will, but it's something that in some contexts, not all, we need to strive for.
So I think, I have a thing here. One is, like so many others who have already spoken, I can't find neutrality. For me, it doesn't exist, and I don't believe in it necessarily as a goal. I think, again, there are tensions, though, right? In a moment when I see so many other things of repression happening at other universities, the kind of pretense or performance of neutrality as a space to allow for some speech here feels like a relief, to say the least, right? But I guess I believe that, in fact, in environments where we can engage people and talk through ideas, I'm a little more comfortable with democracy, Tom. I'm more comfortable with, in fact, being engaged and seeing eye to eye and having a full community think about what are the things that are important to us, and I go back to this, that we value. Not just for the kind of economic production of revenue or profit, but also for the kind of moral, ethical subjects that we would like to be and to have this institution represent. And it seems to me that that is the tension for me, which is how do we both protect speech, pay attention to harm, and deeply engage in a way that moves us towards a conversation that tries to hold both all of those principles and the idea of values, putting forth values that we hold deeply.
Thank you very much.
I don't know.
Thank you
Did
very much. That's very helpful. There was, I believe, yes, you were next. I'm sorry. I don't know your name.
Cathy
Okay.
I noticed you have a pretty clear aversion to the word safe in its role in a college campus or in a classroom. I want you to flesh out that a little bit more. 'Cause I like that word. I think
I do
it's
too.
pretty important. And like I want to feel safe at the school that I attend. And kind of to follow up with that, I wonder what your expectations are of professors and educators to maintain some sort of environment in the classroom that is perhaps inclusive or cognizant of power dynamics or cognizant of the capacity of students to do
I'll go first and then maybe others. I should say that I also believe, when possible, in the production of what we might call a safe environment. The reason I didn't want to go down that route is it has a long history here of trigger warnings and things of that sort, and I didn't want to have that discussion tonight. I believe, in fact, that when people feel safe, they're more able to engage in deep and difficult and even troubling conversations, debates, discussions. And so if, in fact, we can create a relative safe environment for me, for example, in the classroom, then I think it's more productive, more generative, the classroom. I for a long time, believe, I do believe that as faculty in particular, or anyone who is engaging with students, to be at an institution of education, not just higher education, we probably have not invested enough time in giving those who are in the classroom the skills necessary to help produce a safe classroom, to understand what that pedagogy looks like. So yes, I believe in safety. I also, understand, try to say very upfront for my students that I'm creating a classroom where everyone's voice will be respected, and that I'm not going to pretend to have, I'm not going to do a lot of, here's the devil advocacy. I'm going to say what my beliefs are also, and that they understand those, but that all of those beliefs come from a position of respect and wanting, in fact, to hear all voices and all opinions, because that's how we struggle through ideas and issues. Yeah.
But for me, that is the big question. You highlighted as the big central question, but I don't know that we have really even approached to resolve it. I'm just going to historicize it a little bit. I'm a scholar of literature. I work on theater, and I look. One of the things that the question of harm and safety is, of course, one that isn't. There isn't, again, a universal standard. Different participants in the conversation will define what harm is for themselves in a very different way. That's the one side. So there is obviously a complex negotiation that would have to happen, and should happen in a way, to a certain extent, in every classroom. But then there's the other side that and that's why I sort of invoked sort of the history of theater. If you look at Greek tragedy, you can assume this was, of course, all a male audience in ancient Athens. They were all combat veterans. So the function of Greek tragedy is actually, in some sense, post-traumatic processing in a way. And so what I'm trying to say is that we are losing sort of the ability to see sort of the full gamut, what in this case art does. That trauma or harm is on the one hand, but we have also the question of that it's trying to, and again I'm using a historical example, that it's trying to sort of generate and practice resilience. And where do we come down there? And one of the things that both the Chicago Principles and the Kalven Report, of course, also again stress is that education is uncomfortable, or it can be uncomfortable, but how do we get it right? And I'm not saying that I have the answer to it, but I don't think we are, but also clearly we need to have more conversations about it than we're having.
We are out of time. I want you to please join me in thanking our participants for a wonderful conversation. And in the spirit of the last comments, I just want to say that 3CT is committed to cultivating a safe environment where we can also have conversations that are discomforting. So thank you very much.